Good morning, or as it is now, afternoon. Thanks very much for the introduction, and it's lovely to be back in Castlecoot. As I was saying to somebody just a few minutes ago, my mother's from Atleague, and my grandmother taught in Purity, close by. And as a Parnellite, Craig's, which is also close by, is of course a sacred site for Parnellites because it's the site of Parnell's last speech before his death in 1891. I spoke here 11 years ago and on the subject of Parnell and Percy French in a light-hearted paper, and Kevin has been at me ever since to come back and do a reprise, and I kept putting him off and saying no. But in the meantime, there's been quite a bit of research done on the whole issue of the Irish Jarvey and Percy French and politics and so on and so forth, including Bernadette Lowry's innovative book on the subject that has been referred to. So maybe it is timely to revisit that question, which has been mentioned a couple of times in the earlier papers, that subject of Percy French politics and Parnell. You'll notice that I'm fishing in very much the same waters as Brian in his earlier paper, and indeed in the paper immediately preceding this. I hope the papers will be complementary rather than contradictory or overlapping too much. But be that as it may, let's go. Percy French and Parnell may seem unlikely bedfellows for a paired lives summer school paper. They are the original odd couple, one the leader of the Home Rule Party, president of the Land League, the uncrowned King of Ireland, after his death, the lost leader of Yeats and James Joyce's Myth. The other, Percy French, ostensibly with a distaste for politics, an inspector of drains, to use his own term, a wandering minstrel in demand to do a turn everywhere he went, in some ways a slightly sad figure, I think, but a gifted painter and an even more gifted humorist and songwriter whose memory will live as long as Irish people gather and sing songs. While their characters and careers were in stark contrast, our two protagonists have more in common than might appear. Even their differences, I think, are revealing and instructive. Percy French and Parnell represent two ends of the Anglo-Irish spectrum, and this essentially is the core of my argument in this talk, that they represent two different ends of the Anglo-Irish spectrum. And they represent two different responses to the dilemma of the Anglo-Irish who were facing what Leland Lyons memorably described as the Anglo-Irish twilight. That dilemma was a product of the erosion of the religious, economic, social, and ultimately the political base of the Anglo-Irish through a succession of developments in the late 19th and early 20th century, beginning with the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland in 1869, the land war of the 1870s and the 1880s, the gradual transfer of land ownership, the democratization of local government in 1898, and the rise of the Home Rule movement. Despite his background, Parnell was very much at the heart of all of these changes, while Percy French chronicled the changes, albeit in a very indirect or opaque manner. Charles Stewart Parnell was born in 1846 at Avondale, and William Percy French 8 years later in 1854 at Cluniquin. Avondale was built in the 1770s by Samuel Hayes. Cluniquin was built somewhat earlier. An architect who stayed at Cluniquin said it was originally a square block, but then, quote, your ancestors added a room whenever it was required. The Parnells were more recent arrivals in Ireland, coming as they did from Cheshire at the time of the Restoration in the 1660s. Percy French's direct line has been traced back to County Galway in 1610, but the family were certainly there before that. Both Parnell and Percy French were born into well-established families of the middling Anglo-Irish gentry. Hussey de Burgh, in his book The Landlords of Ireland, published in 1878, lists Charles Stewart Parnell High Sheriff since 1874, and MP for Meath since 1875, as having 4,678 acres at Avondale. Christopher French, Percy's father, was Justice of the Peace, was a High Sheriff from 1852. He held 3,701 acres, in other words, about 1,000 acres less than the Parnells. However, the valuation of Avondale was only £1,245, whereas Clooney Quinn was £2,933. That is more than double the valuation of Avondale in Wicklow. Of course, the size of an estate is only one factor determining the status of a family. Your relative position within the county is also important. And here again, the position of the Parnells and the Frenches were remarkably similar. Taking owners of estates of over 10,000 acres as the pinnacle of the ascendancy class, there were 5 such families in Wicklow and 5 in Roscommon. In Wicklow, the Earls of Carysford, Wicklow and Fitzwilliam, and Viscounts Tottenham and Powerscourt. And in Roscommon, Viscount Dillon, Lord Dufresne, King Harmon and the Pakenham Mahons. The Frenches of French Park held about 7,000 acres. These were the families who set the tone for the county, and compared to them, the Parnells of Avondale and the Frenches of Clooney Quinn were relatively smaller fry. They attended social functions with their more affluent neighbours, but they knew their place. Parnell played cricket with the Carysfords and Percy French with the Pakenham Mahons. Parnell was the third of 11 children, 4 boys and 7 girls. William Percy French was the third of 9. Their childhood seems to have been the French's childhood seems to have been happier and less fractured than the Parnells, for whom the estranged nature of their parents' relationship, their father's death, and their mother's frequent absences cast a shadow. Delia Tudor Stewart, Parnell's American mother, had a profound influence on her son's personal and political development. The French family were more settled and had a much wider family connection with cousins in Roscommon, Galway, Leitrim, and various parts of the north of Ireland. In terms of religion, both Parnell and Percy French were members of the Church of Ireland. The Parnells also had connections with the Plymouth Brethren, but the Frenches seem to have been more deeply religious. Percy recalled strict observance of the Sabbath, no games allowed, and only uplifting reading material. His mother, who was the daughter of Reverend William Percy, rector of Carrigan-Shannon, hoped that he'd become a clergyman, but she was disappointed. Like Parnell, he reacted against his religious upbringing in his adult life. It was, of course, from his maternal grandfather, William Percy, that Percy French took the name Percy when he became a public entertainer to distinguish himself from the many William Frenches in the west of Ireland. In terms of family politics, the Parnells and the Frenches were involved in similar sorts of ways in county affairs. Both came from liberal traditions and had reputations as good landlords. Percy's sister Emily recalled that they had no problems with their tenants, and the family tended to make light of political and agrarian disturbances. Percy remembered the land war as follows. There was a war between the landlord and the tenant in those days, but beyond a wandering agent who turned up for lunch with a brace of pistols sticking out of his overcoat pocket, we heard nothing of it. My father's tenants knew that any change they got in the way of a landlord must be for the worst. Avondale and Clooney Quinn had good libraries, but because Christopher French was an intellectual and a keen classical scholar, his library was larger and more varied. Parnell spent little time in the library at Avondale, whereas Percy was a keen reader and was particularly well versed in the classics, something which is reflected in his comic writings. The rivers running through the estates provided the focus for childhood games for the young Frenches and the Parnells. In Percy's case, this developed into a keen interest in boating, something Parnell was far less keen on apart from his time in Cambridge. The Frenches took enthusiastically to the growing Victorian fad of the seaside holiday. They holidayed in particular at Bundoran and Mullaghmore. preferring the latter because the beach was better. The seaside holiday doesn't seem to have attracted the Parnells. It's clear from Percy French's memoirs that his favourite childhood pursuit was organising and playing all sorts of games. Under his guidance, the children organised and produced a family magazine, the Tulsk Morning Howl, also known as the Trombone of Tulsk. An article in a surviving number was a parody of Cock Robin, which began, "Who shot the agent? I," said the thrush, "with an old blunderbust, I shot the agent." Percy himself said that he always remained a child. "I was born a boy and remained one ever since." And I think that there is here, I think, a key to Percy French's personality. He was playful and whimsical and almost obsessive about avoiding the so-called real world of politics or finance. There is a definite sense of escapism in his outlook. Catherine Tynan, who knew him well, said that there was, quote, much of the immortal child about him. His sister described him as, quote, most lovable and most unpractical. Parnell, in contrast, had a strong interest in practical things, and although like Parnell or like Percy French, he was a poor manager of money. Both shared a keen interest in sport, and we've heard about sport in the paper just before this. They both played cricket until well into their 20s. Parnell was the more proficient. Avondale was a centre of cricket in Wicklow, and Parnell played in Cambridge. Percy French played at school in England. He claimed that there were only 12 boys at the school in Kirk Langdale, so he made the first 11. The hard ball in cricket gave him a distaste for the game. Sir Thomas Stafford, recalling cricket gatherings at the Pakenham Mahons in Strokestown, described Percy French as not a very good cricketer, but the life and soul of the team. He simply loved entertaining. Percy was much more taken by tennis, which was by then experiencing huge popularity through tournaments such as Wimbledon, which had started in 1877. Percy French played a lot of tennis and wrote about it almost obsessively. His writing includes rackety rhymes, adaptations of nursery rhymes about tennis, Fitzwilliam Square, a lawn tennis lay, and the tale of a tournament which concerned the first tennis tournament at Fitzwilliam. At a critical moment in Parnell's career in 1884 and in the Irish politics at the time, Percy French's concern is with tennis. The tale is presented in mock heroic style with jousting competitions. This week, the only converse is of ball and bat and net, and men hold monster meetings to determine what's a let. He also wrote about golf, although less sympathetically, and as we heard earlier, about cycling. Percy cycled all over Ireland carrying his paints. And of course, Percy French's most creative and productive pastime was, of course, painting. He was a talented painter who should perhaps have gone to art school, but he was pushed in several directions by his father and eventually into engineering. French's paintings of Irish scenes continue to attract healthy prices in Irish auction houses. Patricia Butler, in her book 300 Years of Irish Watercolours, rates him a talented watercolourist and a gifted artist. I'm not aware of any evidence of Parnell having any talent in that direction, but his brother was reputedly a good painter, as were his sisters Fanny Parnell and Anna Parnell, who did go to art school. Both French and Parnell were educated by private tutors, governesses, and then were sent to school in England. And here there is a very direct connection. Both Parnell and Percy French attended the same school, Mr. and Mrs. Barton's school in Kirk Langley in Derbyshire, although they didn't overlap. Parnell was 8 or 9 at the time and stayed only for 1 year. He had discipline problems, but he enjoyed his time there and told his brother that it was there he learned his boyish tricks. He always referred to it as a bright spot in his memory. Percy French, who was at that school several years later, also enjoyed his experience. He recalled that Mrs. Barton taught him drawing and Miss Barton taught him kissing. Miss Barton, a very handsome girl, taught me that kissing outside the family circle can be quite a delightful pastime. And I knew as soon as our lips met that she was the only girl I could ever love. I found afterwards I had underestimated my abilities in this direction, but this, I believe, is characteristic of most Irishmen. The stories of Percy French and Parnell continue to overlap at university. Parnell followed the family tradition. Delia Parnell said that Parnell went to Magdalen College in Cambridge because his father had gone there and because Magdalen had a good reputation for mathematics. Percy French also considered himself to be a victim of the great mathematician myth. He had been sent to Foyle College in Londonderry for that reason. And as he resisted all the conventional careers chosen for him by his father, he then went not to Oxford, but to TCD to study engineering in 1872. Like Parnell, he was interested in mechanics and engineering. And just to pause, I think the choice of university was very important in influencing the development of the two people. Parnell went to Cambridge and felt an outsider, and it tended to accentuate his Irish identity, his identification with Ireland. Whereas Percy French went to Trinity College, and it seems to have had, if you like, he found his tribe in Trinity and in the nearby Kildare Street Club. And I think had he gone to Oxford or gone to Cambridge, he might have developed in a completely different way, and vice versa in the case of Parnell. Both Parnell and Percy French frittered away their time at university. A contemporary at Cambridge described Parnell as being keen about nothing. He was rusticated following an incident and didn't take his degree. Percy French managed 2 degrees, a BA and a Bachelor of Engineering, but claimed to hold the record for the student who took the longest time to graduate. He claims he only graduated ultimately because Trinity was afraid that he'd qualify for a pension. I think taking up the banjo, lawn tennis and watercolour painting instead of chemistry, geology and the theory of strains must have retarded my progress a good deal. Both Parnell and Percy French were slow to find their métier. After university, Parnell's life was aimless until he drifted into politics. He came to national prominence as the president of the Land League in 1879, leader of the whole Home Rule movement from 1880. Percy French also drifted. He emerged from Trinity, in his own words, quote, admirably unfitted for any profession whatsoever. He worked with the Midland Railway for a time, considered emigrating to Canada, and then accepted a position with the Board of Works as an inspector of loans to tenants in Cavan. On the face of it, it wasn't an ideal preparation for his real vocation, but it did prove productive, giving rise, among other things, to some memorable songs. It was a temporary job, and he soon found himself earning a precarious living as a humorist, a songwriter, and an entertainer. He began writing songs in Trinity, most notably Abdullah Bulbul Amir, which he wrote in 1877 during the Russo-Turkish War, but neglected to copyright, which was a significant financial mistake on his part. The song became a very popular favorite in music halls. It tells the tale of a duel between a Turk and a Russian. Plus ça change. Percy French has been described as that anomaly, an Irishman without politics. But I'm not sure that that's completely true. He always insisted that he had no interest in party politics and was naturally suspicious of party politicians of all hues. Describing his father's attempts to push him into maths and science, he said that his parents had visions of their little son as astronomer royal, telling the gaping world how many billion years must elapse before a single ray of intelligence could penetrate the skull of party politicians. His sister Emily emphasized Percy's apolitical nature. Even in the terrible years of the early 80s, I can't remember Percy actively taking any side. He loved Ireland with a great affection and he loved our people, but it was the gentle, humorous side of the Irish character which appealed to him, not the cherishing of ancient grudges to which so many of our countrymen are prey, in spite of their virtues and attractions and high ideals. To the best of my knowledge, Parnell and Percy French never met, but their paths did cross, at least metaphorically, on a number of occasions. In 1881, 1882, French and Sir John Ross, the last Lord Chancellor of Ireland, wrote a mock-heroic ballad entitled Cold Kilmainham Jail, about Parnell's incarceration in Kilmainham. The ballad, which was probably written in the Kildare Street Club, was later mistaken by Parnell biographers St. John Irvine and more recently Robert Key as a street ballad and cited as evidence of popular sentiment among the poor of Dublin about the uncrowned king. John Ross, who had been at Foyle College with Percy and also in Trinity, recalled that Percy was never a politician, but was always ready to compose a song on any party which gave him an opportunity. They collaborated on some other songs, notably on The Mother-in-Law, Doolin, Poor Law Guardian, and The County Council. None of these three were overtly political, but they do have some political undertones. The Mother-in-Law strikes terror into all sides, including the moonlighters bent on kidnapping the landlord. Doolin, Poor Law Guardian, is an archetype of the new class who now control local government in Ireland after the 1890s. And the County Council satirises the new elite who dominated the popularly elected county councils established after 1898, who are more interested in national issues than in solving local problems such as potholes. The underlying outlook in these songs is unmistakably constructive unionist. We've heard quite a bit about the Irish Jarvey, so I'll run through this fairly quickly. But it is interesting on that question which was raised by Brian in his paper about the extent to which Percy French was political and the extent to which it created a reaction. The cartoons in the Jarvey created a reaction. First and foremost, it has to be said that the Jarvey was a humorous magazine, specialising in a particular kind of humour. The Jarvey of the title was a kind of Florrie Knox character, a lovable rogue reminiscent of the Irish RM of Somerville and Ross more than a decade later. The Jarvey, and it is a humorous, you get ordinary, non-political, just humorous cartoons. Policeman, do you have a license? No. Then accompany me. Certainly. What would you like to sing? It was, if you read it though, it was preoccupied with history and Irish history and with issues of identity, and that's reflected in a lot of the cartoons. There's a lot in this. You could spend half an hour unpacking the different historical scenes that are represented in this particular cartoon. Politically, the Jarvey emphasised, as we've heard, its neutrality. In its early issues, it produced responses from readers, which were clearly invented by Percy French. And one response in the area of politics is a complaint that the Jarvey has too much leaning to the national side, i.e. too nationalist. And then another response saying it's got a decided tendency to conservatism, i.e. it's too conservative. Now, both of these reactions are clearly invented by Percy French himself. But it's interesting that they go to a lot of trouble to assert their neutrality. And you saw that gloriously in the wonderful We Hold the Uncrowned King to Be, which the long poem which was read beautifully earlier by Brian, which can be read to suit a nationalist audience and can also be read to suit a unionist audience. So the Jarvey is trying to say, we're sitting on the fence, look, we're non-political. You may say that, but readers may come to their own conclusions then in terms of what conclusions they reach. And there are some of the cartoons, I think, that are quite subtle and they're revealing and in some cases quite sophisticated. In this case, it's a land agent. It's what's in an aim. Peter O'Flynn to the boys who have shot and narrowly missed him. The curse of the crows to you for murder and blackguards. You came near to shooting a man that hasn't paid his rent for 5 years. The assumption, the nationalist interpretation of the land issue is, well, you have landlord and you have tenant, but in fact, when you look more closely at it, you have all sorts of gradations, including a land agent who may indeed be a local nationalist figure, but who's also a land agent. And I think that particular cartoon is an interesting example of a slightly more sophisticated political message than might appear at first glance. Or this one, which again I think does reflect a kind of a worldview. It's a reflection on the arrival of a new Lord Lieutenant. Lord Zetland was coming to Ireland, appointed as the new Irish Secretary or Lord Lieutenant. And Dan says, "Bedad, I'm told there's a new Lord Lieutenant coming over." And Peter the Jarvey says, "Let him come, the crater, as long as I'm left the tenant of my old house and my bit of land, the sorra hair I care." Which is it looks innocuous, but if you look at the political message of it, what it's saying is, look, high politics doesn't bother me as long as I have the ownership of my little bit of land, or the tenant, as long as I can farm my bit of land. That reflects a constructive unionist outlook that, forget about the large national questions. Let's look at social improvement, and as long as you look after solving issues locally, things will be all right, and don't worry too much about the wider political agenda. You've seen this one before earlier. I think it's an absolutely brilliant cartoon which subverts the stereotype of Punch, the stereotype Irish figure that was popular in Punch in the late 19th century. It's Mr. Punch introduces Tenniel's Irishman to the Jarvey. So on the one hand, you get the simian-like figure, which is propagated in Punch in England, and then you get this very good-looking Florrie Knox Jarvey figure, who isn't any, who's the solar opposite or the polar opposite to that. So the Jarvey is nailing its covers to the mast, or its colours to the mast, and it's saying, we're not going to deal in stereotypes. We're going to represent the real Ireland, as it were. It is a sensitive area, and it does make an attempt to do that. But as it goes on, and you see it does change, and some of the cartoons seem to me would seem to me to have been very much at home in Punch. When you see them and their representation, the figures, as I say, get a little less flattering. And on this issue of whether people were upset, or offended or not upset, the two lower representations of the Irish peasant figure, I mean, if people weren't upset by them, I don't think many people were reading the Jarvey, but if people weren't upset by them, then I'd be very surprised. If some people weren't upset by them, I'd be very surprised. There is, as we've seen, quite a bit of occasional reference to Parnell and the split in the 1889, 1890 in the Jarvey, and as well as that, not in the Jarvey, but elsewhere, Percy French produced a humour response to the embattled Parnell. Parnell, at the height of the Treaty of the Split, 1889, 1890, is fighting for his political survival after the divorce crisis, and he does there's an election campaign. He's doing a tour of Ireland, and speaks in Thurles in August 1891, not 2 months before, 3 months before his death. And Percy French writes, this is one verse of a poem written by, or a song written by Percy French about it. It's not written in the character of the Jarvey or some of the other Irish stereotyped characters that Percy French occasionally used. And it is, I think, a little bit more sympathetic to Parnell than it might surprise you. But O Tempora, also O Mores, it's, those of you who remember your Latin, I think that was Cicero, who O Tempora, O Mores. So which just means what times are these, what times we live in. Does anyone happen to know, am I treating with Whigs or with Tories? And which of my friends is my foes, whether Liberal, back me, or Tory? No matter, I'll never resign, but right to the end of the story in spite of William O'Brien. I think there is a little bit more sympathy. It's in the voice of Parnell, but there's a little bit more sympathy to Parnell in that than in some of the other cartoons. The short period during which the Jarvie appeared, I think, is the climax of Parnell's career. Obviously, Parnell dies in 1891. In my view, it's wrong to suggest that Percy French was completely disinterested in the political questions. He displayed a consistent interest in the larger questions of history and society and identity. In 1890, he published a satirical drama, The First Lord Lieutenant, which is a satire on Elizabeth I and the Earl of Essex, which was laced with spicy contemporary resonance. The preface is in the name of one Andy Geraghty, and it explained that it was intended as a contribution to the current debate about whether the Saxon should rule in Ireland or not. French's musical comedy, The Knight of the Road, later The Irish Girl, was based on a book on Irish rogues and rapparees, particularly the Wicklow highwayman Jack Franey. The Marriage of Eva and Strongbow, produced in 1892, was even more ambitious, but less successful. Reacting to national criticism, French confessed that he was born without a sense of reverence for anyone or anybody, and in a moment of regrettable thoughtlessness, he had made a comic episode out of the conquest of Ireland by the English. One suspects he didn't regret it for a moment. Here is someone who is, in some ways, a product of that event, that is, the arrival of the Normans, coming to terms with history. If that seems a little far-fetched, read the chorus, where the men of Leinster keep calling in the chorus to this opera. They call out for Ireland or history to remember that the Normans were invited. The Normans were invited. French took great care in that opera to arrange the final tableau, the marriage ceremony of Eva, the daughter of the King of Leinster, and Strongbow, the Norman leader. It's arranged after Maclise's famous painting from 1854, which is now in the National Gallery. Nor did Percy French confine himself to historical figures or events, as for instance in the hilarious 1890s recitation, The Queen's Advice to Lord Zetland before starting for Ireland as the new Lord Lieutenant, as overheard and reported by Larry O'Flynn, or The Queen's after-dinner speech as overheard and cut into lengths of poetry by James Murphy, Deputy Assistant Waiter at the Viceregal Lodge, which was based on a visit to Ireland by Queen Victoria and included such characters as Maud Gonne, Willie Yeats, who should be at home, says she, French polishing a poem, says she, and none other than Anna Parnell. But in these parts, says she, they have warm hearts, says she, and like me well, says she. This is obviously in the voice of Queen Victoria. They have warm hearts, says she, and like me well, says she, barring Anna Parnell, says she, and that other one, says she, that Maud Gonne, says she, dressing in black, says she, to welcome me back, says she. The Jarvie failed partly because it didn't have a receptive audience among a Catholic middle class who increasingly dominated Irish life. The reception of French's work continued to be dogged by a perception that he was partisan and condescending. That is unfortunate. Although he spoke through a myriad of characters and had an aversion to being serious, it's possible to divine something of his feelings and outlook from his work. It would be wrong to dismiss his work as trivial. He had a real affection for the characters who inhabit his songs and his stories. 1890-91 was a significant time for Percy French, no less than for Parnell. The failure of the Jarvie coincided with the death of his first wife. He had married Ethel Kathleen Armitage Moore in June 1890. They spent their honeymoon at Castle Howard in the Vale of Avoca, right next door to Parnell's ancestral home in Avondale. Castle Howard was owned by Colonel Edward Brooke. They loved Wicklow and returned to Castle Howard when Etty was pregnant, travelling back to Dublin in poor weather. Etty died on the 25th of June 1891 of septicemia and was buried in Mount Jerome. Her baby survived until July and was buried in the grounds of Elphin Cathedral. 3 months later, Parnell was dead. Percy French, of course, lived on until 1920. He remarried in 1894 Helen Sheldon, with whom he had 3 daughters. His career waxed and waned in the last 30 years of his life, being marked by great success and occasional disaster. He toured widely in Ireland, Britain, Canada, and the United States with Houston Collinson. He wrote memorable songs, entertainments, and reviews, and exhibited his paintings for royalty. During the First World War, he had entertained the troops and donated part of his profits to the Red Cross. He was committed to the war effort, but didn't take a romanticized view of it. The war marked the last phase in the decline of the Anglo-Irish community, of which he was part. Symbolically, an attempt in 1916 to revive his topical review, How Dublin Does It, was disrupted by the Easter Rebellion. He didn't live to see the new Ireland born in the GPO. He died in January 1920, the year the Government of Ireland Act partitioned the country, and he is buried in Formby in Merseyside. The passage of time has made possible a more rounded assessment of the respective legacies of Percy French and Charles Stewart Parnell, but I would suggest that both are figures undoubtedly worthy of commemoration in summer schools such as this. More focal score, as a parting shot, one last and unexpected connection between Parnell and Percy French. In January 1885, immediately after delivering his famous speech at the Cork Opera House about "No man has the right to set the boundary to the march of a nation," words that are immortalised on the Parnell Monument in O'Connell Street, Parnell travelled immediately from Cork, from the Opera House, to Clare and cut the sod for the new West Clare Railway. Just over a decade later, the railway was immortalised in one of Percy French's most popular ballads. Are you right there, Michael? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Another excellent contribution, very, very interesting address. So our thanks to Dr. Pauric Travers, and I'm sure you all found that enlightening. As before, we would welcome any questions or comments.
That cartoon that he presented, you gave a very erudite exposition of it. Do you remember it?
Which one?
Oh, you know was it oh God, it's gone from my mind now. It was the Drake and I think he the Duck and the Drake. I think it was real political.
Yeah.
He really politicized.
Yeah.
There was 2 people at the time. Do you remember who they were, or do you remember that?
I don't remember. You're remembering something I said 11 years ago. That's very good. That's very good, and it speaks well for your brain matter. But I don't remember the particular one. I mean, as we saw this morning, there are some wonderful cartoons in the Jarvie, and I think your project is just fantastic because, you know, to make this material available online all over the world, it's fantastic. I mean, when I started doing the research on this, you had to go to Pierce Street Library. It was the only copy I could get where I could get access to the Jarvie, and then we had the publication of the facsimile edition, and now to have it digitized and put online, it's just fantastic.
But I have to say, Pauric, you have to take credit for that, because when you gave that talk 13 years ago, I mean, you blew us.
Yeah.
You really opened up our minds to it.
Yeah.
So it was then I began to look, says, "Gee, we'll have to do something about this Jarvey," because no one has looked at it.
Yeah.
And Kevin Kiley asked earlier about a doctorate. There's loads of doctorates on
Yeah,
this man,
yeah,
you know.
yeah.
I mean, there really is, and that's what I was saying from the outset, that Roscommon can't look away at this work, and it's a big loss to look past our heritage. And there is loads of doctorates. There's a whole library on Percy French, but you see, he's just been by the elite, you know, and the literati just frowned upon, and as you said yourself, and he's been very much skewed. But he's to blame for it.
Yeah. Well, just, I mean, on that issue, and it touches on Brian's issue, the difference between Brian and Bernadette Lowry's interpretation of whether it was anti-Parnellite or not. I think a lot of the reaction against Percy French comes actually later, not the time of the Jarvey. It comes in the early 20th century with the right of the Irish Ireland movement, and there is a certain amount of evidence of the AOH, for example, taking exception and disruption of some of Percy French's concerts in different parts of the country. There's evidence of some nationalist organisations, but it's 20 years after the Jarvey. So it can't be cited as evidence for the immediate reaction in 1889, 1890 to the publication of some of these.
This lady here, Adrian, just across from you. Yeah.
Pauric, I wonder, you mentioned that the potential reason for the failure or the end of the Jarvey was that people couldn't quite position where he stood. But I wonder, is that maybe his greatest legacy, that we live in a time now where there's not an awful lot of neutral observation of politics. There is always really a partisan position. Is that maybe one of his greatest legacies with the Jarvey, that he left us a reminder of a time when you could reflect and observe and comment, but not from a party political position? Yeah,
I mean, you can argue that it's difficult to. Sometimes, if you listen to contemporary comics, you know, for example, what's your man who's doing Callum's Kicks, Oliver Callan, who's wonderful. But you ask the question: does he have a political view? You know, does the comedian have a view? And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But Percy French certainly asserted, you know, that he certainly, in terms of party politics, he didn't have he didn't take a position. But I do think you can argue that his whole worldview, the world in which he lived and grew up and operated on, is the world of a declining Anglo-Irish community, which you know finally is destroyed by the First World War.
Yes.
But on the question of why the Jarvey failed, it failed because people didn't buy it. And that's the harsh truth for any newspaper. If people don't buy it, and the market was not big enough, as the editors of the Phoenix might tell you, the market is just not big. Was not at that time. Unless the bulk of people are going to go out and buy it, and I don't think there's much evidence that there were huge sales of the Jarvey.
Anybody else like to ask a question? Gentleman at the back. Oh yeah, it's Brian, I think.
Just very quick one, Pauric. I very much enjoyed your paper. You made the comment that the respective careers of Percy French and Parnell might have been very different had one gone to Cambridge and the other to Trinity. Would you like to expand? Like, have you got any ideas as to how they might have developed differently? It's a fascinating idea.
Well, who knows what shapes a person's outlook? But you know, you may feel when you're at home in an Irish context, you may feel one thing, and then you go abroad and you get a heightened sense. And there's no question, but it was when Parnell went to England and went to Magdalen, and it had a very unhappy time, and he was very discontented, and he felt very much an outsider from the society. He just didn't feel at home. And you know, it then isn't a huge step from that to actually engaging as a leader of the Home Rule movement. I don't think Percy French had to face that challenge. I think he was so comfortable in Trinity, within his little circle, within a circle, and I think had he travelled, I'm not sure how it would have impacted on him, but I think if Parnell had gone to Trinity, I don't think he would have had the later political career he had. But those are the what ifs, that counterfactual thing. It's always interesting, but how do we know? You can just speculate.
Yeah, and of course, Yeats' sense of Irishness was very much heightened by going to school over in England as well. His nationalism took a deeper, greener hue from living over there.